Hello, hello, and welcome to Pints with Aquinas. My name is Matt Fradd, and I'm really excited about today's debate. We will be debating the Catholic choice. Should we choose Biden? Should we choose Trump? That's what we're going to be debating today. And I should also let you know that my two debaters, who I'll introduce shortly, have written articles for our Sunday Visitor, which you are welcome to click below and read along, because I believe their opening statements are going to be very similar to the articles that they've written. We have two university professors, Dr. Carson Holloway and Dr. Sam Rocha, who I will have introduce themselves in a minute. As I say, they're going to be debating who is the best candidate for Catholics to vote for. Carson will be arguing for Trump. Sam will be arguing for Biden. Now, we have a debate format. We're going to have opening statements, 15 minutes each. There will be rebuttals of 7 minutes each. Then there'll be cross-examination time. So we took out the second rebuttal because some people said it was boring, so we just jumped right into cross-examination. After that, we'll do audience questions. And there is a link below if you want to ask a question. We're going to begin with my patrons' questions, so feel free to click that and type in your comment over there on Patreon. Before we say anything else, though, and before I introduce our speakers, I want to let you know that I am hosting the largest Catholic apologetics conference that's ever taken place in the history of mankind. It's going to be next Friday through Sunday, October 23rd through 25th. It's 100% free, and you can attend no matter where you are. We have over 50 excellent speakers, people like Dr. Scott Hahn, Dr. Ed Fazer, Dr. Peter Kraft, Gary Machuda. Go and check it out yourself. I'm tired of telling you. But it's 100% free. It's going to be really amazing. Click that link below and register, because after the weekend is over, you'll no longer have access to the talks. We also have evangelical Dr. William Lane Craig, who of course is not a Catholic, but is very Catholic friendly. He'll be giving a talk. We have a few others as well. So please click that link below and register right now for this free virtual Catholic apologetics conference. Again, that's October 23rd through 25th. All right. Without further ado, let me find this link and welcome our presenters today. Dr. Carson, Dr. Sam, great to have you.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks for having us. Yeah.
I thought what we could do before we begin is maybe just have Sam, if you could just introduce yourself, and then Carson. We might take like half a minute each to do that.
Sure thing. Hi, everyone. My name is Sam Rocha. I am speaking to you right now from Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. I am an American citizen voting in Williamson County, Texas. I was born in Brownsville and raised mainly along the borderlands and in the Texas Hill Country. My present day job is as an associate professor in the Department of Educational Studies at the University of British Columbia, and I'm also an active Catholic online and a musician.
Very cool. And you will be arguing the Biden vote,
and I'll be arguing the case for Biden. That's right.
The case for Biden. Thank you. And Dr. Holloway, if you could take 30 seconds to introduce yourself.
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name's Carson Holloway. I'm a political scientist. My areas of interest are primarily American constitutional law, but also political theory, or the political philosophy, the history of political thought. I'm coming to you from Omaha, Nebraska, with the kind help of my mom's living room. I do have a university appointment, too, and I teach students. I'm not going to say any more about that because I'm speaking only for myself and not for my institution, obviously, so we'll leave it at that.
Very good. Okay, so we're going to begin with 15-minute opening statements, and we're going to begin with Sam. And just so everybody knows, I'm going to be keeping time here, and I will let the debaters know when they have a minute left. So, Sam, are you ready?
I think I am. Yeah.
What we'll do is just as soon as you guys start talking is when I'll click the alarm. So, feel free to start whenever, Sam.
Sure. Fair enough. Thank you. Well, thanks to Matt for hosting this, and thanks to you all for listening, both those of you with us live and those of you who will be watching this later. I'm going to stick pretty close to my case, but I'll kind of ad-lib as I move through. My case is really built on a desire to make my case within the Catholic doctrine, but also within the Catholic intellectual tradition. At the same time, the Catholic intellectual tradition isn't opposed to the use of natural reason, so I will be making probably a more philosophical case than otherwise, but that's just what's coming. So the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops and their document Forming Consciences for Faithful Citizenship, they affirm that voting is not only a political act, so this isn't realpolitik. More fundamentally, they show us that it's a moral act. So politics are kind of undergirded by morality. The Church understands voting as an exercise of prudential judgment by a well-formed conscience in the interest of the common good of society as a whole. Catholics, unlike more secular understandings of conscience, don't have a psychological view of conscience. We see conscience as a moral faculty of reason. At the same time, an election, if we just use the word, also has a simpler ordinary meaning. To elect simply means to choose. And we all know that making a choice is not always the same thing as doing what we want or choosing what we like. We might wish it was, but I think most of us know that's not the case. The Church does not exhort U.S. Catholics to vote as a social interest or identity group. In fact, they exhort us the opposite, to use our consciences and our reason. We are called to vote, however, in a manner consistent with the universal call to holiness. I think if you blow this up theologically, that's where you end up. Now, with these moral and theological foundations, voting will not be easy. In fact, they write as follows: Catholics may feel politically disenfranchised, sensing that no party and too few candidates fully share the Church's comprehensive commitment to life and the dignity of every human being from conception to natural death. Nonetheless, the bishops insist that, quote, this is not a time for retreat or discouragement. Rather, it is a time for renewed engagement. Today is also the feast day of Teresa of Avila, who has that very famous nada te turbe, nada te espanta, let nothing disturb you, let nothing frighten you. And so I think we can also bear those words in mind today on her feast day. So using the Church's moral understanding of politics and answering her call for renewed engagement in the spirit of the Doctor of the Church, St. Teresa of Avila, I present this case to vote for Joe Biden in the 2020 presidential election. My case will rely upon two principles: social realism on the one hand, and minimal reason on the other. Now, by social realism, I simply mean a sense of what is actionable today. Social realism, as I understand it, concedes that there are better ideal options, but these options are not real. There are also perhaps better real options we could choose as individual voters, for example, third parties, write-ins, or abstentions. But these, I claim, reflect individualistic rather than social options because they are ultimately forms of self-expression, not public participation. Social realism then, and this is really the first major premise of this case, asserts that there are only two real and social options: President Donald J. Trump or former Vice President Joe Biden. By minimal reason, the second principle, I simply mean the lowest standards that are nonetheless sufficient to call someone a rational person. In the Church's understanding of this, you might even say that minimal reason means sort of having a conscience in the Church's understanding of conscience. These two principles respond directly to the bishop's instruction in Faithful Citizens and also to other documents that I might bring up throughout this debate. Social realism accepts their exhortation to engage by agreeing that political engagement must correspond to its social reality. You could say that you could engage sort of any way you want, but if you're not really engaging with the thing that's real, I would say you're probably playing make-believe and not engaging. One might try to do this in a negative way by taking third-party or write-in options or abstaining as a kind of conscientious objector, although I would be careful to use those expressions about being conscripted to war as being the same as elections. This strikes me as quite different things. But this, I claim, would not be real engagement because it ultimately ignores the fundamentally social nature of this reality. Politics is about society. It's not about individuals in the sort of bared-down abstract. Now, I expect Trump voters, and I would expect, although I might be surprised to learn otherwise, Carson, to agree with me about this. So I don't believe this plank of my case is actually that controversial here. Now, social realism also affirms the bishop's teaching, and I quote, "As Catholics, we are not single-issue voters." This is out of the mouth of the bishops. This isn't out of my mouth. Single-issue voting violates the principle of social realism. Why? Well, precisely because a single issue is a part, but it's not the whole. So treating the whole through the part misses in the same way the reality in front of us. Now, minimal reason emerges, I claim, from social realism. When we consider the social reality of the de facto two-party system in the United States, it's not de jure, I realize that, but it is de facto. Within the full scale of issues, the question is, which candidate meets the principle of minimal reason? Who has a conscience? We should pause and probably ask how the principle of minimal reason relates to church teaching. You'll notice that I did that for the first principle, but I haven't done it yet for the second. The essential theological content of faithful voting, as the bishops teach us, is the virtue of prudence, the theological virtue lived through the praxis of prudential judgment. You could say that prudential judgment is the way in which we make the virtue of prudence come alive, and that's what praxis means. This requires a well-formed conscience. Our bishops, in fact, warn us, quote, Catholics must also understand that if they fail to form their consciences in the light of the truths of the faith and the moral teachings of the church, they can make erroneous judgments. This is quite different from the secular psychological understanding of conscience, where if you're conscious, you have a conscience. Catholics admit that, sure, being conscious is important, and having a conscience, this begins to fulfill it, but it's a necessary but not sufficient condition of conscience. The idea of conscience the church promotes is a conscience that's well formed. But then the question emerges is, how is the conscience formed? Well, conscience, and this is a standard Thomistic thing, so hopefully on this show it won't be controversial. Conscience is the human faculty of moral reason. Aquinas refers to this as synderesis, and Benedict XVI has adjusted this in his teaching on conscience to mean anamnesis, two very different concepts, but we don't have time to go into that now. The church prescribes a number of conditions for the formation of our conscience, and these conditions begin with, quote, a desire to embrace goodness and truth, and from there they include a series of dispositional traits and also practices and recommendations. Now, this very teaching of the conscience entails a principle of minimal reason. And this is where kind of my idea comes out. For instance, the ability to read for understanding would be one. And I don't mean a literacy requirement. What I mean is that it seems to be the case that whenever the bishops teach us things, they assume that we can accept their teachings through the use of our minimal reason to judge them and make sense of them. In fact, they even say, don't just accept our teachings, but use these teachings in tandem with larger teachings. Well, this entails, I think, a number of basic abilities that minimal reason would account for. Now, this may seem too basic. It's my claim that in this election, precisely this minimalism is enough to inform a prudential judgment. The bishops rightly affirm that the Catholic who votes must be a rational person in the Catholic sense of that, capable of fulfilling the requirements of minimal reason. If these are the assumed characteristics of the voter, well, why not use them for the candidate as well? Which candidate best fulfills the principle of minimal reason? Which candidate strikes us as having a conscience? Who will read, listen, and take counsel? Who will conduct themselves as a rational person while in office? I firmly believe that this person is Joe Biden. Joe Biden's platform is presented in 48 parts on his campaign website, each responding to a particular policy, issue, and interest group. At minimum, this platform shows an ability to listen and take counsel that differs significantly from Trump's record, which a historically unprecedented number of Republicans and living presidents have publicly renounced in an act of conscience. By the way, don't get too excited about Biden's platform. Everybody is supposed to have a platform, and you don't even write your own platform. Usually those are negotiated at the national conventions. For the first time in the history of the Republican Party, Trump just doesn't have one. So that's a very basic distinction we can make in terms of having one and not having one. Like the aforementioned contentious Republicans who have departed from Trump but remain members of their party, Catholics too will surely not agree with every proposed policy or issue on the platform and in general. But in Biden, the principle of minimal reason is sufficiently present to a degree that one simply cannot find in the impeached Trump. I don't want to be too triumphalistic about this, by the way. I think this is a fairly tragic situation. Imagine being at a restaurant and being sat on the floor and being told by your waiter that, look, we have 2 items on the menu that will actually serve to people. And you can either choose unsalted, dry, 3-day-old potatoes, or you can be served a bowl of dirt. Obviously, no one should feel too much enthusiasm here, but I believe that one can reasonably say that they should choose the dry 3-day-old potatoes and not choose the dirt, including if they feel like, well, I've got some pizza in my car and I can go get it. Well, you'll be forcing everybody else in the room to eat dirt if you don't vote for the 3-day-old potatoes. So by all means, maybe you have a better life, or something like that. The point I'm making here, though, is that it's really important to me that my case not be over-determined. And this is going to slightly constrain me in this debate, but I want to accept that constraint quite openly, because I think it's important for Catholics to not over-determine their cases in politics like many secular politicians often do. The reasons for voting for Trump, my reasons for voting Trump, are admittedly very modest. Let me be clear. I did not support him in the primary, and I did not vote for him when he ran alongside Obama. And I also didn't vote for Hillary Clinton last election. However, if one engages realistically with U.S. politics and rejects individualistic options as forms of disengagement, and this would include single-issue voting as being contrary to Catholic teaching, then the principle of minimal reason I have proposed here is a proportional moral and political criterion that carefully distinguishes Biden from Trump without over-determining or overblowing the reasons we might have to vote for Biden. Remember, we're talking 3-day-old unsalted potatoes, okay? Not a filet mignon. Without minimal reason, a person cannot be said to be rational. The irrational person, the person with no conscience, is in no moral or political position to vote, and much less to lead a nation. I mean, if you can't really fulfill your duties as a voter, how in the world can you do it as a leader? Even if the irrational person with no conscience was able to make themselves useful to Catholic interests, like Stalin abolishing abortion during his period as the leader of the USSR against the Bolsheviks who legalized it, doing so in the absence of minimal reason would in fact not be consistent with the Church's moral understanding of politics, rooted in the virtue of prudence and the proper exercise of conscience. This election, I believe, is about a return to minimal reason by voting in a socially realistic way for the candidate who displays sufficient standards in word and deed, spirit and letter that makes for a rational person. This is, I believe, about who has a conscience. Along with his robustly consultative platform, Biden's record of experience as a senator and vice president, and especially his record, including some awards he's won for this, of bipartisanship, working with Republicans, which he's done throughout his career. These all indicate that he is someone who reads, who listens, and takes counsel. I would also add his screw-ups in his last 2 attempts to become president and his ability to learn from them and to stop doing some of the things he did in '87 or he did later on, I think also show his ability that we have a much more chastened Biden, and thank heavens for that. And the real contrast of Biden versus Trump, it is my firm prudential judgment.
1 minute remaining.
Thank you. It is my firm prudential judgment, and this judgment, by the way, hopefully isn't in bad faith, but I've already mailed my ballot because I live a long ways from Williamson County, so it's on the way. So it's been exercised, that judgment, is that Biden is clearly the person here who has a conscience and who is the minimally rational of the two whenever we compare Biden from Trump. If anybody wants to sort of, test this case in a very concrete way, I would suggest going to twitter.com or on your app and just taking a look at Trump's Twitter feed. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Rocha. Okay. Carson, are you ready for your first opening statement for 15 minutes?
I'm ready.
All right. Feel free to begin whenever, and I'll click the timer.
Okay. Well, like Sam, I want to thank you, Matt, for having me on your show, and thank Melanie, your assistant, for her help with the logistics. And I want to thank everybody who's watching for their interest in the election and their seriousness about our country's future. And I, of course, want to thank Sam for being my sparring partner and giving us a lot to think about in his excellent opening statement. Now, before I make my case for the re-election of President Trump, let me offer a few preliminary remarks just to be clear. Obviously, in my arguments today, I'm not claiming to offer any kind of official exposition of Catholic doctrine. That job belongs to the ones who have the authority to do it. And I'm just offering my best judgment as a Catholic and an American. And as I said before, too, I also want to clarify that my opinions here are only my own and not those of any institutions that may happen to employ me. Finally, I do kind of feel like I need to say this. On the one hand, I view the debate as an educational venture because I think both Sam's and my arguments will help Catholics to think about and to clarify our thinking about how to exercise our right to vote and how to think seriously about politics according to Catholic principles. On the other hand, I do have to say that I am actually personally happy to be able to make the case for President Trump because I did vote for him and I'm going to vote for him again, although I'm not going to mail it in. I will walk in to do it in a few weeks. Now, on to my argument. Like Sam, my case is based upon the editorial that I wrote for our Sunday Visitor, in which we both appeared, their election edition. And like Sam, I want to take as my point of departure the American Bishop's letter, Forming Consciences for Faithful Citizenship. So the bishops remind us that we have a duty to participate in American politics and to guide our participation by Catholic principles. So charity, that is love of God and love of neighbor, calls upon us to do good in all of our activities. We have to live the call to love in family life, at work, in our recreations and our friendships, and in politics. So we can't compartmentalize. We can't be Catholics at church and then not in the voting booth. Faithfulness also requires us to do good, not according just to our own personal conceptions, but according to what the church teaches. We have to apply church's principles to political questions. As the bishops also remind us, and as Sam said too, political participation requires not just knowledge of principles, but also the exercise of prudence. Prudence is the virtue by which we apply principles to concrete circumstances in order to get not the best conceivable result, but the best available result. America is a large and diverse country that is not predominantly Catholic. And in such a country, we can't expect realistically to have a party or even a candidate that is perfectly satisfactory according to Catholic standards. Therefore, as the bishops say, we have to exercise prudence in order to make the best choice possible in the given circumstances. Well, how do we do that? I argue that we have to prioritize, and that the most reasonable way to prioritize is to take first, or to pay attention first to what is most fundamental and most urgent. I would say, by way of analogy or illustration, that in the noble quest for perfection, everybody should try to make their house as clean and beautiful as possible. So make improvements, hang pictures, repaint. But if the house is on fire, prudence tells you to drop all of that and put out the fire. Or if the foundation is bad, you put everything else aside and attend to the foundation. So what is most fundamental and most urgent in American politics today? Without, I hope, being a single issue voter, and we can talk about that later, I would say it is the right to life and the threat posed to the right to life by abortion. There are many things about our national home that could be improved, but I think this is where the worst problem exists. The bishops tell us in the aforementioned letter that the dignity of the human person is the fundamental principle of Catholic social teaching. The Church thus rejects as intrinsically evil any direct attack on innocent human life. Taking of innocent human life cannot be rightly willed by any person or rightly authorized by law. Accordingly, the bishops present the threat of abortion as their, and here I'm quoting them, the bishops' preeminent priority because it directly attacks life itself, because it takes place within the sanctuary of the family, and because of the number of lives destroyed, close quote. And I would add that besides the immediate human cost, the ideology of abortion rights obscures our understanding of the minimal moral requirements of a just society, that every human life should be protected by law. So here I contend that a powerful case can be made for President Trump's reelection. In a mass democracy like ours, it is vitally important to have a political movement that's willing to openly and consistently affirm the truth that life is sacred and that abortion is therefore wrong. And I think it's especially necessary in a country like America where you have powerful organs of culture, entertainment, and politics that relentlessly teach the opposite, that abortion is a right, and therefore some lives can be regarded as disposable. Anytime any one of us speaks out on this issue, we're helping to build a culture of life, and those efforts are good. But part of my political judgment is that there's no substitute for a movement that speaks to the country as a whole. And that's why I am grateful as a Catholic to Trump for his efforts, both as leader of the Republican Party and of the nation. He has spoken out on this question more forcefully and more openly than any president since abortion became a national issue. I say that as a pretty much lifelong Republican who has viewed many Republican candidates and presidents as ones who were somewhat dragged kicking and screaming into talking about this issue. So Trump has affirmed this issue both, I was going to say in various very prominent settings, in his State of the Union messages, in his addresses to the Republican National Convention, and in many other public settings. Striking to me, for example, that Mike Pence, his vice president, is the first sitting vice president to attend the March for Life. Trump is the first sitting president to attend the March for Life. President Reagan didn't do that. George W. Bush didn't do that. The other Bush didn't do that. So on this issue, I think of Pope John Paul II, who told us, "Be not afraid." That's his motto. Trump is not afraid on this. Moreover, and equally important, maybe more important, the president has matched his actions to his words, moving American policy in a more pro-life direction. So his administration has moved to restrict federal funding of family planning organizations that refer for abortion. He's restored the Mexico City policy, which prohibits American tax dollars from being used to promote abortion in other nations. And he's called upon Congress to enact legislation protecting the lives of children who were born after an attempted abortion. Now, here's something else very important to the question to me. In America, our problem is not just that the law has been permissive and even encouraged abortion. We have a deeper problem than that, which is that many people have the misconception that abortion is a right under our fundamental law or under our Constitution. And that misconception has been created and sustained by the Supreme Court of the United States since its ruling in Roe versus Wade in 1973. And in fact, that ruling and later rulings upholding it make it operationally the case that abortion is a constitutional right in America. Roe, however, is based entirely on made-up constitutional principles. There's nothing in the Constitution's text or history that suggests that it protects a right to abortion. The Constitution is silent on that question. And in fact, many jurisdictions in America had prohibitions or regulations on abortion for a long time before the court discovered this right in 1973. So I'm contending that Roe is a product of pure judicial activism or judicial legislation. So you could say that for a Catholic, the bad news is that America's fundamental law has a grave moral distortion in it, a supposed right to abortion. But the good news is this distortion is not really a flaw in the Constitution, but in the court's contemporary interpretation of it. The only lawful and practicable way to correct this distortion of our Constitution is to elect presidents who will nominate and senators who will confirm federal judges, and especially justices of the Supreme Court, who are committed to interpreting the Constitution according to its text and original meaning. Trump has promised to do that, and he has in fact done it, and the latest example of this is his nomination of Judge Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court. Moving on to another issue also of fundamental importance, the Trump administration has also worked to protect the Catholic conception of the common good in another area of fundamental importance, family and religious liberty. So the bishops, again in the letter, remind us that the family is the basic cell of human society that's founded on marriage, understood as a union between a man and a woman. The Church teaches that this conception of marriage expresses an essential truth about our humanity and also a necessary requirement of a good society. Now, due to another ruling of the Supreme Court, that understanding of marriage is no longer reflected in American law. I would claim then that it's all the more important that individuals and institutions of civil society are free to proclaim and act upon the truth about marriage. But that in turn depends upon a robust conception of religious liberty, which is under threat these days, according to the bishops. There's some states that would impose legal penalties, for example, on traditional Christians who don't want to assist at a same-sex marriage, or under the Affordable Care Act. More recently, the Obama administration tried to enforce a mandate that would require, say, the Little Sisters of the Poor to offer health coverage that includes abortifacient contraception. The Trump administration has been a defender of religious liberty in the courts on those issues, seeking to protect the rights of conscience of Catholics and other traditional religious believers. So those are issues, I think, of fundamental importance. I do want to, in the spirit of not being a single issue voter, talk about other more prudential questions. For example, in areas where I think Trump has a record that Catholics should approve. The church teaches us that war is sometimes necessary, but we should avoid it as earnestly as we can. I think Trump differs from the two previous presidents in that he has not involved the nation in any foreign wars, has instead tried to get us out of them, and he's made it a point of his public rhetoric that we do not want to be we don't want to be involved in any wars that are not really necessary to defend the nation. I think he's courageously put his reputation on the line in a way that I've never seen any other president do in order to convince North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons and try to be a normal, peaceable member of the community of nations. He's also worked hard to normalize relations between countries that have been hostile to each other, like the Arab nations and Israel. He's been nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize for those efforts. So that's something to approve in Trump's record. And then also, I would add, of course, the church calls on us to improve conditions for the economically disadvantaged. By cutting taxes, cutting regulation, promoting American manufacturing and American labor, Trump succeeded in bringing unemployment levels down to historic lows, and particularly noteworthy, but I think not talked about enough, helping the wages of the lower half of American earners to rise more quickly than the wages of the upper half, or the compensation of the upper half, something that had not been true in America for a long time. And those gains have been disrupted by the coronavirus, but I think there's good reason to expect that they will return if we stick with Trump as president. So on these and many other issues, President Trump has kept the promises that he made as a candidate in 2016, and that brings me to another matter that I think ought to be of deep importance to Catholics and to all Americans. So in the letter and in many other statements, the bishops remind us that we have a duty to be engaged in politics, to work together, to vote, to improve conditions in our country. I contend that that whole enterprise becomes a kind of farce or a show or a joke, to put it bluntly, if you don't have candidates for public office that actually intend to enact the platform or the program on which they've run. If they use issues to gain votes and then discard those issues once elected, they've made kind of a sham out of our democracy. It's a representative democracy. It's a republic. We don't have direct participation. So our ability to influence events for the good depends upon the straight up honesty of the officials running for office to do what they said they're going to do. And I find, as somebody who's observed American politics for a long time, 30 years, that Trump is really exemplary in this area. It's actually kind of shocking, and I'll just give an anecdote that illustrates this by way of maybe coming from the opposite side. Watching one of the shows, I guess I won't name the person out of charity, but watching one of the shows in the spring of 2016 where one of the commentators on television was really critical of Trump for campaigning in the spring of 2016, actually the summer of 2016, on the same issues that he'd raised from the summer of 2015 into the primary season. And when I saw that, I thought, this person's attitude is actually, how dare Trump not be a phony by campaigning on the same issues in the general election that he campaigned on in the primaries. It's a pretty typical approach among politicians to emphasize one set of issues in the primary elections, get the nomination, then, as they say, move to the center in the general election. Trump didn't actually do that. Trump has a platform that's kind of a combination of traditional conservative, populist, and centrist, and he basically ran on the same things from the first day until now. That is a kind of honesty, and he's done that despite serious and unprecedented opposition. And I think that that is something that is actually healthful for our democracy, and I think American Catholics and anybody who values real representative democracy should respect that and should vote to reward it by reelecting him. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Rocha and Dr. Holloway. We're going to enter our rebuttal period, in which each debater will have 7 minutes to respond to what each debater had to say. Before we go any further, do us a favor and smash that like button, share the link on social media, and I think this is really fantastic. I mean, this is one of my hopes for a debate like this, is that we could have a charitable and substantive exchange, so it's really cool to see that this is happening. Sam, whenever you'd like to begin, I'll give you 7 minutes.
Okay, thank you. I have about 8 different kind of line item things to respond to Carson, but I'd like to thank Carson And I also want to make it clear, just because I realized whenever Carson was so clear about his vote, yes, I voted for Biden on that ballot that's on its way to Texas right now. So, yeah. I want to start off with the question of abortion, because obviously that kind of was I would say, most of the argument that was presented in the case for Trump. And I'd like to offer a few rebuttals to the claim that Trump is not afraid, or that Trump's pro-life speeches are sort of sufficient grounds upon which to consider his record as profoundly pro-life. Let's start with the most recent things we know. In both the presidential and the vice presidential debate, there were questions that were the issue of abortion was raised, and Trump in his own debate said that Roe v. Wade is not on the table, and quote, "There's nothing happening there." This is what Trump himself said. He was very clear that Roe v. Wade. I doubt he's a constitutional scholar, so he probably couldn't win the argument with Carson. But he seems to be under the impression that this is different than the way it was represented by Carson. Although more revealing, perhaps, was a vice presidential debate where the moderator asked the vice president in a hypothetical the idea that Roe v. Wade would be sent back to the states, and that the state of Indiana, which is, of course, Mike Pence's home state, that the Hoosier state would have the chance to sort of decide on this. What would it be? And you'll notice that Pence actually just didn't respond to that question at all. So if it's the case that the president and the vice president are this robust, unafraid pro-lifers, it doesn't seem to come out whenever they face a national audience, only when they go and speak in very particular cases. And so that's something I think to keep in mind with respect to word and deed. When we get into the deeds, though, I think we find that a closer analysis of some of these policies are really helpful to make sense about what's going on. Now, every Republican president since Reagan has, usually the first day of office, reinstituted the Mexico City policy. Whenever they reinstitute it, though, they reinstitute it in very different ways. And so actually, you could say that Reagan, Bush, and each of them have different Mexico City policies. Most of these policies usually cut about $600 million worth of funding, give or take, to NGOs in order to prevent them from promoting mainly abortion, but also other things in family planning. Trump's Mexico City policy withdrew almost $9 billion, 8.8. Now, you might say, great, even better. Well, the problem is that a lot of the things within that $9 billion almost were things like AIDS relief, malaria, a number of things that actually provide all kinds of humanitarian relief around the world. What Trump did is he just kind of, like a person without a conscience, withdrew the whole thing without thinking about it, without dividing it, like most other Republican presidents have done. So I doubt that's a sign of confidence. With respect to the Born Alive Act, the Born Alive Act was actually passed in 2002. How do you think Gosnell was prosecuted? So the Born Alive Act that was voted on the floor was an extension and an amendment to a previously existing act. So what Trump is trying to do here, and which I believe Carson is slightly misrepresenting, is the idea that Trump somehow created this out of nowhere. This policy has been on the books for quite some time, and it's been acted upon, as we saw in the horrendous case of Gosnell. Now, finally, when it comes to family and marriage, I don't think it behooves Catholics to drag a debate into inconsistencies of character that create salacious and scandalous impressions of people. So I'm not going to do that, but I would just ask the viewers to ask themselves whether they really think Trump is the champion of traditional family and traditional marriage that they want to have. Now, when we move to North Korea and Arab relations, I agree here with Carson. In fact, one of my greatest hopes for Trump in this term was that his sort of know-nothing quietism, not knowing really much about the world, would cause him to actually withdraw from foreign wars. But we've actually seen that his record has been quite different on this. He's had a very up and down and inconsistent approach. The assassination of Soleimani, for instance, if you just follow the different reasons that Trump gave over like a 1-week period, they changed at every turn. A lot of generals said, look, we don't disagree with the choice, but boy, we're getting all these different signals, and it's really destabilizing the Middle East. The withdrawal entirely from the Iran deal which one can dispute on policy or whatever, but the withdrawals from many other deals from many other organizations, climate change, many of these things show that Trump, like the Mexico policy, kind of just kind of trumps around, removing the U.S. entirely from things without thinking about the details. The other thing I think I would say with respect to the destabilization in the Middle East is that Trump has also been very selective about this. Whenever the Russians put bounties on American soldiers' head, he never responded to that. I think it's speculation to answer why. Some people think it's because he's some kind of a maniac or whatever. I just think he dismissed it. He doesn't pay much of attention because he's not a particularly rational person. And we can give a lot of different examples of what this, how this works through. The impeachment articles, whether one agrees with with the impeachment at all or not, if you look at the two articles, you can see that they're largely not things he did actively. They're not really, in Catholic speak, sins of commission. They're sins of omission.
1 minute.
That he failed to do. Now, with respect to the final thing that I'll say on taxes and wages, income inequality in the United States is, I think, a major issue, and Trump's tax cuts, which are among the hallmarks of his plank, largely benefit quantitatively, if we divide the dollars, corporate taxes and upper class taxes. So I think there's something missing there. He's taken a lot of credit for the renegotiation of the USM, the new NAFTA, essentially. And I think whenever we look there, we can actually get into the details and really look at the fact that, again, this is Trump saying that he did something that actually people did before, people did on behalf of him. So for all these reasons, I think we can see fairly thoroughly on these different points that the case presented for Trump is perhaps misleading when we look at the details. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Rocha. Dr. Holloway, whenever you're ready, you can have your 7-minute rebuttal. Start whenever you like.
All right, I'm ready. And just for the sake of clarity, what I want to do here is respond to Sam's original case, and we can talk about perhaps in Q&A or in Q&A with the audience the other issues he's raised in his rebuttal. So I do want to focus on the interesting question of social realism and minimal reason. And I agree with Sam on the importance of those principles, but of course I disagree on the application of the case before us. So social realism requires us to do what we can to defend and improve the real world in which we're actually living, and not just dream about an ideal world that cannot come to be. And that dreaming, I guess, is human and has its uses, but it's not the same thing as responsible political action. So I want to talk about social realism as it applies to the world and as it applies to America. With regard to the world, social realism, I think, requires us to accept the fact that China is going to be a major power. What I don't want to accept, however, is that China is going to become a dominant power and set the tone for the world. We don't want the tone for world politics set by a communist nation whose understanding of human rights is so lacking compared to the dignity of the Western conception informed by Christianity. The rapid rise of China's power has been the result, in part, of China's own willingness to engage in predatory trade practices and the willingness of Western elites to overlook those practices. It seems to me that the prospects for ending that combination of Chinese assertiveness and Western submission are much better with Trump as president than with Biden. Trump is the only Western leader to confront this problem and to take steps to correct it, while Biden is a lifetime member of an American leadership class that actually enabled the rise of China. With regard to America, social realism requires us to recognize that there is no present realistic prospect of making America into a Catholic nation or a nation whose principles and policies are informed across the board by Catholic social teaching. There is, however, a realistic prospect of preserving America as a nation in which Catholicism and other forms of traditional Christianity have the breathing room they need in order to freely proclaim the faith to our fellow citizens and to freely live it out ourselves. So I think that goal is better advanced by voting for Trump, who has shown by his actions that he is a friend, or if you want to say his Department of Justice is a friend to religious liberty. And I think that goal is threatened by voting for Joe Biden, because no matter how well disposed Joe himself may be, and I think based upon news reports, you do have to give him some credit. I understand that with regard to those mandates that the bishops found problematic in the Affordable Care Act, that Biden had argued in the Obama administration not to do them. So that's a good thing. Good for Joe on that. However, I still think it's better to vote for Trump on this issue because, as I was going to say, no matter how well disposed Joe is, his administration will be staffed by social justice warriors with law degrees who will want to go back to the more anti-religious approach that was developing under the Obama administration. Now, I do want to talk also about minimal reason. And the focus here is not so much on principles or policies or social movements as the person who will actually occupy the office of the presidency, Trump or Biden. And I think Sam is right to bring this up. America has a unitary executive. That means the president is the one person responsible for running the executive branch. A lot of people who work below him, but the president calls the shots and sets the tone and calls for the direction of the executive. So that's a massive responsibility, especially considering that America is the most powerful country in the world. I would say that it is more reasonable to think that Trump is equipped to handle that job than Biden is. Now, the most general reason is that Trump has actually succeeded in being president of the United States for 4 years, while Biden has not had that experience. In 2016, many people warned, and I can understand why they would warn, because Trump's personality and his public persona can be highly combative and alarming at times. But based upon all that experience, in 2016, people warned that Trump lacked the character, the discipline, the attentiveness to detail to be president, and they predicted all kinds of disasters that would follow if he would be president. And I think they were proven entirely wrong. The country's done quite well with Trump as president by any reasonable measure. And here it's worth noting, too, that the presidency requires, as an executive leadership position, not just the willingness to consult and to listen and to learn that Sam rightly emphasizes, but also certain decisiveness or an ability to act in a timely manner under the pressure of events. Joe Biden's career doesn't really suggest any preparation for that. Most successful presidents, most presidents have prior executive experience, either as governors or in the military, or in Trump's case, the head of a big business organization. Most of Biden's career was spent in the Senate, which is a very slow-moving organization. It proceeds on the basis of consensus. There's just not much individual responsibility there. And even in that environment, Biden was never in a position of high leadership. He was vice president for 8 years, but the vice president doesn't have to take responsibility for anything. And just as I want to be charitable like Sam and not go into personal issues too much, and I'm not going to on Biden, without making any extreme claims about him, I think it's obvious from watching him that he is not as quick and as energetic as he used to be. And there's reason for me there to doubt that he's up to the rigors of the presidency. Finally, Sam emphasizes the consultative aspect of minimal reason. Good presidents have to not just act decisively, but have to act in consultation with others, to listen and to learn from others. That's true, but I just don't doubt, based upon kind of the practical observations that we have before us, that Trump is able to do that. I think it's a caricature or a cartoon of him as a person who can't do that. You could talk about his business career. I don't think he could have succeeded in that if he weren't willing to listen to people. Commercial real estate depends upon lots of people who have specialized skills that you don't have. So I think he would have had to have listened to advice. But we see it today with regard to, say, like the COVID pandemic. I mean, Trump clearly was reluctant, like any national leader would be, to shut down the economy. But he did it. He led the country in doing that because scientists and public health experts like Dr. Fauci told him that's what needs to be done. And I remember over the spring when this stuff was discussed, Fauci said he's listened to our advice. Democrat governors have said the same too, about the things they needed. So I'll stop there. But that's my rebuttal for now.
Okay, thank you very much. Before we move on to our cross-examination period, which I'm very much looking forward to, I wanted to say thank you to Exodus 90, which is a 90-day Catholic spiritual exercise for men. Basically, you get together with a few men, and for 90 days, you live an ascetical life. You give up things you'd rather not give up, like alcohol and sweets and snacking between meals, and then you take on things that maybe you're not used to taking on or don't want to take on, like praying for an hour every day and only having cold showers. I did this last year, and I found it really great. And it was very bloody difficult, but it was actually really amazing. So if you're a man who wants to take your spiritual life to the next level, click the link in the description below, exodus90.com/MattFrad, because they plan on starting right at the new year. So you don't have to start up right away. You still have time to find your fraternity, but it really is an excellent way to grow in your faith. Exodus90.com, Exodus90.com. I also want to let people know about a debate that we have coming up next week, which you don't want to miss. It's between Stephanie Gray Connors and abortionist Dr. Malcolm Potts. That's going to be on the 20th of October, so we hope that you can join us for that one. Okay, so now we're going to go into our cross-examination period, where each debater will get 15 minutes to cross-examine the other. And I want to remind the audience that the cross-examiner is allowed to interrupt and move the flow of the argument as he sees fit. So it's not a matter of being rude if Dr. Holloway or Dr. Rocha decides to push the other person along. In fact, it's kind of expected. So, Sam, we'll begin with your cross-examination for 15 minutes whenever you're ready.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. I think within the realm of pushing, I'll probably push back a little bit on the idea that a good cross-examination is indicated by how much I push. I think, Carson, you've really done you set a really good stage for us to have a conversation on essentially three, to my mind, anomalies that emerge in Trump's campaign right now. So the first one, I think, is something that you might be able to talk about from personal experience, but I'm genuinely interested to hear what you have to say about it. I don't know of any precedent, and you may correct me here on the record, for so much of a present incumbent's parting company with the, there isn't a living president right now, and had Bush Sr., may rest in peace, been around, he wouldn't have changed the scales either, as far as we know. There isn't a living president right now that supports Trump. His party has left him in droves. John Kasich is at the DNC giving speeches for Biden, the Massachusetts governor. We have over 70 intelligence officials, so on and so to speak. You're a lifelong Republican. So I think you may correct me on maybe there are precedents for this, but B, I would like to just hear what your responses and maybe what your explanations might be for this highly idiosyncratic fact that the supporters of Biden are not all rabid leftist street protesters, but a lot of them are basically lifelong Republicans like you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a very interesting point. I do think that you are correct about the fact. Bush, I suppose, has just remained silent. I think you're right. I did see recently that, and it's the case that Bob Dole, who's kind of a Republican establishment guy, does support Trump, but a lot of these people don't. That's true. I would like to say a couple of things in response to that, and this will help lay out perhaps my view of American politics over the last couple of decades. One is, and you don't have to tell who you voted for or anything. It's not I'm trying to game this out of you or trick you. But I would say that had Bernie Sanders won the Democratic nomination, it is likely that there would have been many prominent Democrats who would not have supported him or would not have endorsed him. And if he'd won before, there might be ones who would not support his renomination or reelection.
If I can cut in real quick, just to give you, just to affirm your intuition here, you've got me dead on right. I was a Bernie bro, so that's fine. Okay. Carry on.
Good. So to go back to, I've got a couple of points I guess I want to say on what you said, or what you asked me about rather. My sense is that the people who run the Democratic Party viewed a Bernie Sanders candidacy as a real threat to their control of the party, and that they would rather lose with him as the nominee than let him win. That's speculative on my part, but I'm using that to illustrate the point that the Republican Party was run for a long time by a certain set of people who came to view it as their property, and they're mad that Trump came in and took it over, and I think they're mad at Trump's voters as well for allowing him to do that. As a student of, I don't want to get too much in the weeds here, but I'm a student of political thought. Although I'm a Catholic, I learn as much as I can from Machiavelli. And Machiavelli says that, if the people rebel against the prince, you got an incompetent prince. And I kind of view it that way too. The Republican voters rebelled against their natural leaders in the spring of 2016 because their leaders were no good. And just I don't want to filibuster here, but you've raised a very interesting thing to me about American politics. Here's how I understand it. And why are these people so opposed to Trump? It seems to me that in a healthy representative democracy, you would have some party polarization on controversial issues like free trade or trade policy and on immigration. And basically, you had a situation where the establishment of both the parties are basically in agreement on those issues. Yeah. And Trump came in and created a political polarization on those questions. And now you have basically, one party that's more immigration skeptical, one that's more pro-immigration, one that's more trade skeptical, if he can wrench it to his will on that, one that is more pro-free trade, perhaps.
Fair enough.
But in doing that, you're going to drive people out. The same thing, and I don't want to go on and on, but same thing happened in Britain with Brexit. People left the Tories.
Sure. No question. And actually, I want to get in this next question to the international aspect. So bringing up Brexit, I think, is useful. I would simply note, though, that you don't necessarily dispute the fact of the record that this is an unprecedented exodus from party for an incumbent in particular. The second point I want to ask about is actually having to do with Trump's, dare I say, philosophical approach to governance and campaigning, his America First, protectionist reputation, and also way of carrying himself. There's two things I want to bring up here and ask you to respond to them. One is that amongst international heads of state who support Trump, he has a fairly infamous group. He's got Bolsonaro, Duarte, Modi, Netanyahu, Orban, and Putin. Now, 2 weekends ago, Pope Francis promulgated a new encyclical, Fratelli Tutti, that explicitly talks about the dangers of the rise of nationalism and populism by name. In fact, in paragraph 11, he says, ancient conflicts thought long buried are breaking out anew, while instances of a myopic, extremist, resentful, and aggressive nationalism are on the rise. In some country, a concept of popular and national unity influenced by various ideologies is creating new forms of selfishness and a loss of the social sense under the guise of defending national interests. It seems to me, from a Catholic perspective, a candidate, an incumbent like Trump, who has gathered this rather robust group of strong men, leaders of state, with an America First protectionist rhetoric, a populist approach, as you yourself admitted earlier, it would seem like it would be very difficult for the Catholic conscience to bend towards this idea, especially when it's so out of joint with the very contemporary teachings of our church today. How would you respond to that?
Okay, good. I got a couple of things on that. In the first place, I just want to clarify. I'm not aware that Putin or anybody has endorsed Trump for president. That would be a pretty direct interference in our election that I don't think those guys would engage in. I'm sure those guys have said nice things about Trump the way world leaders say things about each other, just as he said. But you're not contending, are you, that they've endorsed him or said, like, I'm Vladimir Putin and I approve this message, vote for Trump?
No, I am actually asserting that. I don't have my receipts right here in my pocket, but if you'd like to press me on your cross-ex, I'd be happy to pull them up for you.
Okay, sure. Well, I think, I would be interested to see that. On the other question, though, about populism and America First nationalism, this may just be a difference in perception. I, of course, agree with everything the Holy Father says about aggressive nationalism or selfish nationalism. I would contend, and I've actually written about this online in a brief article, that I view Trump as what I would call a liberal nationalist, like somebody like Alexander Hamilton or George Washington from the era of the founders. That is, they believe that countries operate primarily in their own self-interest, but they also believe in an international realm of justice or law, and that nations shouldn't behave aggressively with each other. It seems like a strange thing to say, and I hope I don't discredit myself with all of your viewers, Matt, by saying this, but the fact is, Donald Trump is an old-fashioned liberal. He doesn't really stand for anything that liberals didn't stand for in the 1980s or the 1970s. Things have just moved at a rapid pace since then. And so, his rhetoric is sometimes pretty strong. But I think even in the realm of rhetoric, it's kind of a typical Trumpian formulation when talking about foreign policy to say that we defend our interests first, we expect other countries to defend their interests first, but we have to treat them fairly. Now, does he treat them fairly every time? That would be a matter of debate, I think. But the principles, I think, are not bad. And so I would not necessarily, I mean, I don't know what the Holy Father is thinking or who he's thinking about, but I would draw a distinction between aggressive nationalism versus a kind of protective nationalism as a response to globalization. Go ahead.
Sure. No, thank you. Another unprecedented, that again, if I'm very nervous cross-examining a political scientist as just a know-nothing philosopher over here, but it seems to be the case that not having a platform coming out of the National Convention is another new and unprecedented move by Trump. And so, first of all, as far as I know, this is the case that there has not been. It has not been the case that a Republican nominee, incumbent or otherwise, has emerged without an approved platform. And so maybe this interfaces a bit with my first question, but I'd like to ask you to talk a bit about, maybe as an expert, perhaps, why in the world doesn't Trump have a platform?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'll admit that I was a little surprised by that and maybe even disappointed, because I would rather see him run with a clear delineation of what he intends to do, or a clearer one. However, I would also add that the party platforms are not entirely binding on the candidate. I mean, they're really not binding at all. Even Joe Biden said in that first debate when Trump tried to tie him to the left wing, he said, "I am the Democratic Party."
Yeah, that was really bad.
So that's I hated that. But he's not the only one to say something like that. I remember there was talk about the party about the platform in 1996, and Bob Dole, who was then the Republican candidate, said, "Yeah, well, the platform can say whatever they want it to say. I'm telling you what I say. I'm the candidate." So there's a kind of sense in which the platform is maybe not as important as we'd like it to be, because we don't have the kind of disciplined parties that can even make the president obey the platform.
Matt, can I check in real quick on time?
Yep,
I'm sorry.
you have 4 minutes. No problem.
Okay. Finish up there, Carson. I want to see if I can sneak in one more question. Yeah.
Sure. So just to finish up on that, I do think that's a reasonable criticism. I guess I would say when Trump ran in 2016, his platform was extremely detailed and straightforward, and I think people know what he stands for by this time. And he doesn't have a platform, but he does have a statement of issues on his website. So pretty much people know where Donald Trump is coming from. I don't know if it's going to be more of the same kind of thing, I think.
Sure. Fair enough. Trump has... I have kind of two questions I want to ask about. Maybe I am in a pool. Ultimately, I think Matt's going to get this one on me. I tried to resist the aggressive CX, but quickly, I would like to hear your impression of the fact that, as far as I know of, Trump's record on capital punishment is basically that he's for it, and he's for it a lot. Capital punishment has been declared inadmissible in this last encyclical, and seems to be a life issue that should matter, especially with someone with as much enthusiasm for it, it seems, as Trump has. How do you square that one?
That's a really important question. Are we going to talk about this for the rest of our time, or is there other things you want to talk about?
I had one more, but I'd just like to get your intuitions on this, and I'd be happy to speak about the question later too.
And I thought you might want to raise that. I mean, I was going to say, and I have two things on that. And the first one is very conditional and tentative. And I'll only say this, and I'm not saying it on my own behalf, but on behalf of other Catholics, and I'm saying it conditionally. I am not entirely sure that what the Holy Father and the bishops have said about capital punishment is binding on the conscience of a Catholic who, in good conscience, thinks it is necessary to protect the common good.
No,
but let's say that it is. Let's give that for the sake of argument. Yeah, I think it's that's one of those ones where you'd have to exercise prudence. And I would draw a qualitative and quantitative distinction. I mean, a handful of people are executed in America every year, compared to abortion, which, as you've written about, involves lots of people, and they've been convicted of heinous crimes. So
sure. I'm actually, you might not expect this, but I think there are some distinctions to be drawn on the church side of the difference between intrinsic evil and inadmissibility. So we may not be as far off there. I guess the last question I want to ask you is, I think the role of the president, and I'm here thinking everything from fireside chats to, addresses in times of crisis. Whether we like it or not, the president's office has a moral component to their rhetoric and their speech. And over 200,000 Americans are dead as a result of COVID-19. Without claiming that there's some causal relation between Trump's presidency and these hundreds of thousands of deaths, do you believe that his speech and his rhetoric and his way of talking to the nation is presidential and meets the sort of moral conditions of the kind of formed conscience that people who are grieving their loved ones need to hear?
Right. I mean, Trump is not always presidential. The answer to that question is sometimes yes and sometimes no. I mean, Trump does sometimes give formal, in fact, a lot of the time, he gives formal addresses that are perfectly compatible with the standards of the presidency that we like to see. But then he has his Twitter account and he has interviews and he sometimes gets rough. I mean, that's something that I think many people who support the president don't necessarily like all that much, but it's something they're willing to take as part of the package deal. I don't think it's entirely unprecedented, though, because, for example, you mentioned fireside chats. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a great president by most measures, people would say, capable of dignified rhetoric, but he could be a brawler, too. I mean, he referred to his enemies as economic monarchists and things like this, trying to make it sound like they're not really Americans. So
thank you so much.
It's a rough business.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And thank you, Matt, for checking in on us.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, now, Dr. Holloway, you have 15 minutes to cross-examine Sam, and just for the sake of those who are just tuning in, I want to remind the audience that the cross-examiner is allowed to interrupt and move the flow of the argument as he sees fit. So whenever you start, I will click the timer.
All right. Well, thanks, Matt. And I'll say, like Sam, I'm not a big interrupter, and I haven't done debate since high school, and I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not expert at cross-examination. The only ones I've really done are to try to figure out who spilled something on the carpet, and those are usually failures. So I'll do the best I can with this cross-examination. And I do want to clarify something from your case, Sam. And I don't know, maybe the viewers, I hope they view this as interesting and important, but it was interesting to me as somebody who's interested in political thought, political philosophy, and politics. I mean, I think you're right that voting for a third-party candidate or just deciding not to vote is kind of more of an act of self-expression than an act of political responsibility. But you wouldn't say, would you, or maybe you would, that it's impermissible for a Catholic not to vote or to vote for a third party. I mean, that's in conscience, they could do that, couldn't they?
Absolutely. I mean, to be honest, I think the teaching of the church, from the U.S. church to the global voice of the church, gives a Catholic within a well-formed conscience the ability to pull the lever for Gloria La Riva, Kanye West, Brian Carroll, Donald Trump, Joe Biden. The difference is what reasons one can give and the way in which one can submit those reasons or show their consistency to church teaching and principle, generally speaking. But yeah, no, I'm with you on this completely. Yeah.
Okay. And then I think you're right, too, in your case to admonish us that we're not, and you're channeling what the bishops say, that we don't vote as an interest group or a social identity. So I guess, I mean, right. So you would agree with me on this, wouldn't you, that although it might be tempting for some people, Catholics shouldn't vote for Joe Biden just because he's Catholic, right? And
absolutely not. No. I get a lot of people, because of my public stance, who send me the article of a certain cardinal saying that Biden should be denied communion. And as far as I can tell, it's a non-issue for me. Trump can't receive communion either. I'm not really of the view that that's a strong calculus one way or the other. And so we could have, good Catholics who are bad politicians and bad Catholics who are good politicians within the sort of moral realism that we're working in, for sure. Absolutely.
Okay, and then just to kind of flesh that out a little bit more, and I guess you probably already agree with it. Maybe I don't even need to ask it, but American Catholics should not vote for the Democratic Party out of some kind of ancestral sentimental attachment to it, right? Isn't that the case? Because a lot of Catholics have been Democrats.
I understand. Yeah, no, my grandparents are both old Kennedy Democrats, and maybe here I'll risk inconsistency with saying, in principle, I agree. These are not good reasons. However, the formation of conscience does not exclude entirely subjectivity. And so if one's sentiments are formed by lived experience and a certain number of ways, I could see, different than your other two questions, how it could enter into the frame. So it would be a necessary but not sufficient reason to do that. Yeah.
Okay, I like that. That's a very careful answer. In other words, it's not a good enough reason, but it's not necessarily a bad reason if somebody's
That's right. It's not
voting
the
on
end
the
of the
basis of it.
story. Yeah.
Okay. Um, okay, so let me ask you this too.
I feel like you just set me up. So go ahead.
No. This is actually a somewhat different issue.
Okay.
I guess. I mean, you're right that Catholics shouldn't be single issue voters. And the bishops say that too.
Yeah, that's not me. That's the bishops. I just
right.
Them.
At the same time, though, they do say that this question of abortion is their preeminent concern. So, I mean, it's not unreasonable, is it, for American Catholics to treat this as something that weighs more heavily on their minds than just about anything else, given the gravity of it, even though we can't discount everything else?
I agree in general. If you'll permit me just a ability to flesh this out a bit, I think whenever the church teaches that abortion is a preeminent issue, it's referring to the reality of abortion, which is the reality that corresponds to the intrinsic evil that it declares it to be. What I mean by this is I think we have to be careful not to conflate the intrinsic evil of abortion as referring only to abortion legislation. For instance, Nicaragua right now doesn't allow any abortions. Venezuela allows abortions only in extreme cases and exceptions. Yet abortion is still at issue in Nicaragua and in Venezuela. And so in the United States, the moral concern for abortion is not exhausted by a legal or by a legislative concern for abortion. Just like in Canada, or I imagine in Australia, sorry, Matt, I'm just picking up countries. The concern for abortion is preeminent globally, but that doesn't necessarily reduce it or monopolize it to one particular legal aspect or whatnot. So in some cases, there are even oblique approaches that one can account for in that way. So with that condition, I would say yes.
Okay. Well, let me ask you then about the kind of the constitutional argument I was making.
Oh yeah.
I mean,
you're going to wax the floor with me on this.
Well, I just want to see what you think about this question. I mean, it seems like American Catholics for a long time have had it as a goal that seemed out of reach, but may not be, to seek the reversal of Roe and restore an understanding that abortion is not a fundamental right that precludes debate in the states about the extent to which it should be regulated or made illegal. So I guess, do you think that's an appropriate goal for Catholics to seek that?
Well, maybe here's where we'll part opinion, although I don't want to try to engage on the constitutional or even the jurisprudence simply because I'm not equipped to do so. I'm not an expert on this, and so I won't have the capacity to do that. So maybe that's a failure on my part. But I will say this. I've been Catholic all my life, and I've lived through, Reagan to now. And at every single election juncture, I've heard the pro-life argument that this is the single most important election of our lifetime because Roe v. Wade's going to be repealed. And to be honest, it was very convincing to me for a long time. But it seems now that there's a kind of a temporal question that I think we should add to the question of constitutional intent, which is whenever the thing that I'm saying is going to happen, if you just vote for me, doesn't happen for a long time, why should you keep voting for me? That for me is essentially the very simple temporal breakdown to me, where at this point, I'm even willing to say that, not in your case, because I suspect you have stronger constitutional arguments to offer, but in a lot of cases of political rhetoric, the claim that abortion is going to be repealed through the repealing of Roe v. Wade, which would, of course, send it back to the states, and then what's the end game there? I'm never sure. This is a rhetoric I'm used to hearing, but I'm not used to seeing anything done about it. And certainly Trump hasn't done a thing about it in his first 4 years, I would say.
Well, I guess it depends on how you understand his commitment to the judges he's nominated. And I guess by that, too, I mean, to me, I guess I'm supposed to be cross-examining you, but I was going to say, it's interesting to me that, as you said earlier, Trump doesn't know anything about American constitutional law, yet he's able to nominate people who know a lot. And I think that's example of, or evidence of, his ability to consult with people or to defer to experts.
Carson, I think you and I both know very well that the American judiciary is overseen by a very powerful and also a very capable a political interest group that includes many robust public Catholics that I'm sure we both know.
Yeah. Okay. I guess another question I wanted to put was, and maybe you've already answered this, but this is, here's my background on this. I have not been a Catholic my whole life. I converted to Catholicism in college.
Okay.
And I was not pro-life my whole life on this question of abortion. In high school, I was pretty much pro-choice. And what happened is I went to college, and it seemed to me that the arguments that were made on the other side, on the pro-choice side, were being made in bad faith, that they were usually criticisms of the character of people who are pro-life, saying that they don't care about women or they want to hurt women.
Yeah.
So gradually, I changed my mind on that question, and I think I became a Catholic in part because the church was very clear on this moral issue, although that's not the only reason. Obviously, you become a Catholic because you accept the whole thing. So that's been a large part of my thinking, both in relation to politics and in relation to the faith. So, I mean, it just seems to me that, and maybe you can respond to this, you're right that it's been a long time coming. One could look at what's happened with Trump's election and the people that he's nominated to the Supreme Court and say, it looks like it's within reach now. And if you vote for Biden, you're putting it off indefinitely. You're kind of agreeing that we're going to live in a country in which abortion will be a constitutional right indefinitely. I mean, do you view it that way?
No, I don't necessarily view it that way. I mean, I can see how one could construct it that. All I'm trying to say with this temporal case is that whenever someone repeats the exact same promise to you so many years in a row, one becomes slightly less convinced of its effectiveness on the fifth or seventh or eighth time. In my case, if I can just respond to your biographical, which I appreciate, by the way, Carson, I appreciate that. I'm a cradle Catholic, grew up in a lay missionary Catholic family, strongly pro-life. I think when I was 9, I was praying rosaries in front of abortion clinics. I have to say, when I read John Paul II's Evangelium Vitae, and I expected it to be about abortion and realized it was about a whole bunch more stuff, it didn't really make me less pro-life, but it made me realize that I was primarily living my commitment to the church's teaching on life expressed simply through abortion, and through abortion expressed simply through a very particular lens of Roe v. Wade and whatnot. And John Paul II jolted me at a time when we were talking about preemptive war, whenever capital punishment, as it has been for some time, was on the table, as I began thinking about questions of social inequality and whatnot. And I would say it radicalized me significantly. And then the pontificate of Benedict XVI, in particular, some of his, not only his theological teachings, which I do love, but especially in some of his social teachings and their development, it's only led me to more firmly affirm the church's full teaching on life, which to me is not reducible to a singled out idea of even abortion itself. As I said, Stalin went against the Bolsheviks who made abortion legal in Russia and made it illegal. I'm not prepared, nor are you, I'm sure, to endorse Stalin's platform for communist Russia, nor am I prepared probably to endorse the Venezuelan approach to abortion, where it's also illegal in most cases, nor do I think that Nicaragua is enjoying the fruits of an abortion-free society. It's clear to me that if we take a realist approach to abortion, then we have to have a different conversation, and not one that continually makes promises that it never fulfills and then reaps the harvest on different goods and different entities, I would say.
Okay, good. I guess I want to ask about a couple of other things. I mean, I'm glad that we're friends now. This is
sure.
Good. You told me about
Fratelli
your support
tutti.
Yeah, right.
We're all brothers.
In view of your political sympathies, you've admitted that Biden is not your first choice.
No.
It seems like your first choice would be something very different. I mean, in view of that, can't you see how many people would view it as not a criticism of Trump, but actually a plus that all of these former presidents won't endorse him?
Sure,
In other words,
sure.
these are not people who
Absolutely.
have managed the country's affairs admirably.
Oh, completely. No. I think that the anti-disestablishmentarian case that says no, the defection of the Republicans shows that he's actually doing what he said he would do is a very powerful and convincing talking point. Again, I think when you get into the details, though, and you ask, well, why precisely? And do they all agree? So it would make sense, for instance, if everyone said we're leaving for the same exact reason. But when you look, you see that different GOP folks are leaving for different reasons. Some are saying, I'm leaving and I won't vote for Trump, like Bush. Others are saying, or basically, I'm not leaving, but I won't vote for Trump. Others are leaving entirely through endorsing Biden. And so this variety of reasons leads me to believe that there's a much more complicated thing happening, and that for many of these Republicans, they're actually practicing this act of conscience, where even though they are lifetime Republicans, their love of their country differs from their nominee. And so they're exiting on those reasons. And I would say that probably there are a number of people leaving because Trump irritates them and takes down, you could say, their access to power. I'm here thinking primarily of like the FBI and the CIA. Like I'm not the my politics are not the ones to say, yay, FBI, yay, CIA. That's never been my thing. One of the reasons I thought Trump was almost funny in the last time was I was like, well, finally, the U.S. is going to get a taste of its own medicine. But my attitude towards that is fairly agnostic. But I think there are other principled Republicans that we can listen to and see and find very different reasons. So here we would have to kind of break apart things and kind of check through the details.
We've got about 17 seconds left. So,
well, let's punt then. I think that's good.
All right. Thank you so much.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. We are about to move into a period of 30 minutes of Q&A, and we are going to be fielding the questions from my patrons. And of course, this is where I do the plug for Patreon. So if you want to support the work we're doing here at Pints with Aquinas, please go over to patreon.com/MattFrad. Start supporting us. You get a ton of things when you do. Beer steins, signed copies of my book. We're currently doing a 7-part video series on Augustine's Confessions, which is being taught by Dr. Chad Engelin from the University of Dallas. We're continually doing things like that. It's a happening place, and of course, it supports the show. So if you want to support the work that we're doing, please go to patreon.com/MattFrad. Patreon.com/MattFrad. All right, so here we go. Each person gets 2 minutes to answer a question addressed to them, and then their opponent gets 1 minute to respond. So let's see here. First question will go to Dr. Rocha. This comes from Devin Odell. How do you justify the consistent and unabashed persecution on Catholic communities through unfair and unjustified gathering restrictions that aren't being imposed on secular gathering places? How do you justify the socialist-leaning trends of the left in light of the historical fact that socialist governments always view the Catholic Church as a hostile organization that needs to be oppressed?
Thank you, Devin. I take your question as having two parts. The first related to COVID requirements, and the second one being a historical question, and I'll try to answer them in kind. I'm not familiar with the exact policies. I saw some of the press coming out of San Francisco, for instance, and I have spoken to parish priests, both in Canada and in the U.S., who have concerns about the different regulations applied to the church here. I would simply say that, though, COVID is new for everyone. I don't think COVID is a situation from which we can deduce or expect. I think it's too early in the middle of COVID to decide whether these things are anti-religious or if they're logistical or what they are. I would practice a bit of kind of temperance on that. I would say, though, that whenever you talk about the historical things of socialism, if you had been in Tanzania during the time of Julius Nyerere, who's a venerable, you would have experienced a socialism under his idea of ujamaa that is in fact fully Catholic, and that the church has basic. Well, I mean, he's a venerable now. And so it's not the case, actually, that socialism in every case, social democracy, New Democrats, social democrats all over the world, in fact. The head of the Scottish Socialist Party is a traditional Catholic in Scotland. It's simply not the case. This is a caricature that Americans have tried to to use in order to say that totalitarian red communism is identical to social democracy, democratic socialism, and it's simply false on arrival. I would tell you one cautionary tale, though, from the history of Mexico, which is there was probably not a more anti-clerical and anti-Catholic government than the than the Mexican Revolution. But out of that revolution came counter-protests that were also deeply troubling, like Maciel's abuses that were largely built on the fervor of people going against. So be very careful about being sucked into anti-Catholic rhetoric and allowing it for other excesses in the other direction.
Okay, Dr. Holloway, you have a minute to respond.
Sure, I'll take those issues in reverse order. I think Sam makes a good point about social democracy. I mean, Pope Benedict has said nice things about social democracy. I think I'm not going to argue or try to brawl on this question. I think it's an interesting issue for Americans because America is not a socialist country, and American Catholics who are conservatives have to think about how to love their country and make it as good as it can be while still kind of leaving it what it is. And then on COVID, too, I think what you said is pretty sensible, although I'm also glad that Attorney General Barr is there to speak up for the idea that restrictions on religious gatherings that are different from restrictions on other kinds of gatherings are questionable under the Constitution, and people need to be careful.
Mm-hmm. Is that annoying, me saying 20 seconds? I can stop doing that.
I love it. It's really helpful, yeah.
All right, good.
I have no conscience.
All right. Eric Whalen, and this goes to Dr. Holloway, who'll have 2 minutes to respond, to the pro-Trump advocate. That's you. I am assuming you believe, by the way, I haven't read these questions in advance, just want you to know that.
Okay.
But I'm making sure we go back and forth. I'm assuming you believe, Dr. Holloway, the abortion issue is disproportionately impactful when compared to any of Biden's pro-Catholic views, i.e. Biden being more aligned with Catholics on the death penalty is not equal to Trump being aligned with Catholics on abortion. Could you come up with a realistic, hypothetical political position, maybe one that is currently being discussed in the political sphere, that would justify voting for a pro-choice candidate?
Can I come up with a hypothetical?
Yeah.
That would justify, yes, Eric, yeah. And just to be clear, I'm not advocating voting for any pro-choice candidate, but it is, and Sam and I agree on this, and I can see that from his article and from the way we've talked about it. It's the church's teaching on this question is not so direct that you could rule somebody out for casting a vote, even for a pro-choice candidate. In other words, voting is a very complex act. You're taking into account very many things. So the obvious answer is, if you're stuck in a country with two candidates to choose from, and they're both pro-choice, then it would be a defensible act to vote for one of them. Or you ask for a hypothetical. I often think of hypotheticals. So here's one that came to me the other day when I was preparing for the debate. I mean, obviously, if you had one candidate who is anti-abortion and another candidate who is pro-choice, and let's say the anti-abortion candidate is also a proponent of an imperialistic war against some other nation, then as a Catholic, you would have to think hard about whether to support that person. Mm-hmm. So there are circumstances in which you could justify a vote for a pro-choice politician. And of course, the church is very helpful on this, telling us we have to distinguish between material cooperation and formal cooperation. You would not vote for that person because they're pro-choice. You would be voting for them despite the fact that they're pro-choice.
You have 30 seconds left. You want to wrap it up there, though?
I was going to ask about that, Matt. We don't have to use the whole 2 minutes.
Yeah, not at all.
Is that like an outer limit? Okay, that's what I want to say about that question.
Thank you. Go for it, Dr. Rocha.
I have to say I'm very impressed by Carson's economy of expression. It is not a virtue that I have. I mean, one hypothetical, and this is going to relate to the very segment in Patreon, is having sort of a Patreon account as a Catholic, given Patreon's sort of identity as a company, and Jack Kant, the musician, who I love, actually. I watch his Pamplemousse stuff and his Scary Pockets. I bought one of their albums here, so I'm not using him as a scary person, but I do notice that obviously while Patreon isn't a political entity, it's definitely a fairly mainstream representative of American culture, which has its sort of no one should accuse anyone who has a Patreon account of being sort of complicit, or through their choice or through accepting money or through using it, that they're in some way promoting abortion or what have you. That's ridiculous. The same applies in this case to other elections we make, including political ones.
Okay, thanks so much. This next question comes from Luke, and this is for Dr. Rocha. A lot of people say Catholics can vote for Biden because even though he promises to keep abortion legal, abortion rates might go down because of his policies. Can you give us another example of where it would be okay to vote for a candidate who promises to keep it legal to kill a certain group of people because his policies might reduce the rates of that killing? Now, he has a follow-up here. I don't mean to go on. I know this can... Yeah, but he says it's a bit wordy, but I mean, would we say, well, you can vote for someone who wants slavery legal forever or rape legal forever because their policies might decrease the number of rapes or slaves? Go for it.
Yeah, this is an interesting question. I will say that the way it's framed is obviously rhetorically provocative, and so I'm not going to hold back any punches in returning the favor. First, I actually disagree with the left-wing and Democratic talking point about when abortions go up and down with presidencies. They've even created some metrics based on the Guggemacher Institute. Here's why I think that's dishonest. Because the only thing that's happened since Roe v. Wade is abortions have gone down. So when you look at the slope of the quantitative data, they're actually going down. And the things that explain those things going down, in my opinion, actually are not usually related to the things that people are talking about. It's a difficult question for Catholics because the thing that seems to bring them down in many cases is access to contraceptives, which throws us into a very kind of difficult double bind if our desire is to bring an end to actual real abortions, yet this is the thing that reduces them, at least within the statistics. So I would say the setup is poorly done because it relies on a talking point and not on a serious assessment of data. So I would tell this person to go back and revise their premise and make it more serious. But the question of can you kill people if you just kill them less? Well, if Donald Trump is the incumbent, then it assumes that he's been killing people for 4 years. So the fact of the matter is that it's built on a really shoddy and soft underbelly of the fact that if we accept the premise of that we're killing people, how do we kill them less? Then how do you justify 4 years of killing people, including the 200,000 that have been added by COVID? So I think this question is actually kind of a standard kind of talking point I'm used to, but it's not very inspiring or interesting to me.
Okay. You have a minute to respond, Dr. Holloway.
Well, yeah, of course, I don't think that the situations are exactly analogous because Trump didn't kill the people who died of COVID. They died of COVID and other related ailments. Now, it could be that the response could have been done better, although in fairness, I would give him or any president benefit of the doubt because it is, as Sam said a few minutes ago, a highly unprecedented and difficult situation in which to operate, and there would be a learning curve with anybody. I mean, I guess, although Luke asking the question was being provocative, I mean, there is something to be said for that point of view. In other words, that a law authorizing a certain kind of violence against innocent human beings is a bad problem in the fundamental constitution of a regime from a Catholic point of view. And so, I mean, that's why I treat it as such a highly important question. So I'm sympathetic with that, but that's all I can say about it, I guess.
Okay. This next question is for Dr. Rocha. I beg your pardon. I think I've got to go around. Dr. Carson. This comes from Ruth Tello. Among both my family and church community, which are mainly Hispanic and Catholic, saying that you are voting for Trump is almost like a slap to the face. I see this trend among low, mid-income Hispanic communities. By voting for Trump, it would be like saying that we support a president that does not care about our immigrant family or people who are here under DACA. What would you say to these communities on why they should vote for Trump?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I can certainly sympathize with that point of view. And it does remind us that there are more issues than just the ones I talked about. I think that I would say you should still vote for Trump for the reasons I talked about, although you would not want to for the reasons you raise. But with regard to the issues that you raise, I think that Trump is open to working something out for people who have benefited from DACA. there is a constitutional debate about whether it can be done in the way that President Obama did it by executive action. That's why these lawsuits are being pursued with regard to that policy. But yeah, he's open to compromise on that. I think he wants to. There have been opportunities for that to be done, and they have not come about yet because both sides are treating this as kind of a political football and seeing who can have more leverage. I mean, I think the Democrats are to blame for that too. There could have been compromises on this a couple of years ago, but both sides, I think when a deal fails to happen, it is not always just the fault of one side on that. So I would be hopeful, based upon what he said, that something can be done. The other thing to remember is that any executive is in a bad situation with regard to this issue or any other kind of similar issue. People were deported from the United States under President Obama. The law of the United States calls for that remedy. It doesn't have to be applied in every single case, and I think a good case can be made for leniency in many instances, and we would hope an executive would do that where it can be done. But the law exists. The president has a constitutional obligation to see to the faithful execution of the laws, and so this is, I guess, another point to be made is it's an issue and a problem no matter who occupies the office of the presidency, because Joe Biden's not going to simply do non-enforcement of immigration law either. I think he's promised a 100-day moratorium or something like that, but he's not going to do that for his whole presidency.
Okay. Dr. Rocha.
Yes, well, I am Mexican-American, so I'll speak directly to the point because this is my community, back in Texas in particular. The first thing is I think that we have to be very careful about the way in which our communities are framed by politicians. So in the case of my family, ancestrally from New Mexico and Texas, we never crossed the border crossed us. La frontera nos cruzó. What this means is that there's a certain colonial indigeneity to Mexican Americans in the Southwest and Texas, which is often forgotten by both parties, to be honest. But it's particularly insulting then whenever Trump sort of frames a conversation around Hispanic identity as some kind of ethnic other to a country that literally has towns named San Francisco, Los Angeles, Santa Fe, San Antonio. Give me a break. The language of the Spanish language is deeply embedded here. And so I think while we need to be careful, we should take this into our hearts and our concern of the way that Trump has framed our community.
Okay, thank you so much. So this next question is for Dr. Rocha. This is from Todd. He says, what would a Catholic presidential candidate have to say that is contrary to church teaching in order for you to believe a Catholic cannot vote for him? Do you have any line that you won't cross?
Yeah, this is interesting. I mean, first of all, because of the phrasing of the rhetoric of the question, do you have any line that you won't cross is kind of disingenuous because it implies that I have no standards or no principles. I built a very clear case based on two principles that I enumerated, and I think I've defended them with some consistency throughout this debate. So I wouldn't accept the implication at the end that there are no lines here. Obviously, there are lines. However, we also have to realize that whenever we're making a decision between two options, the one option doesn't stand alone to the exclusion of the other. So, here I'm going to say something very controversial historically, but I think it's something that we can't put out of our minds. During a lot of the Catholics during the Vichy French acquiescence to Nazis were opposed by personalists, by like Marcel, like Mounier and many others, Emmanuel Mounier. And I have to say, there were Catholics on both sides of this, and there were good reasons why some of the Vichy French chose, not retrospectively good, but I can see why they made the decisions they made. I stand with Mounier, but I can see how those arguments go the other direction. So we can look at history and realize that sometimes there are very difficult choices that have to be made, and Catholics have not always made the right choices. But I do believe that we don't have to pretend as if there's not two things and that there's some absolute line in the abstract that we put down here. So again, I would reject the very idea that there is this absolute line to the exclusion of the other case. This is not the way the world works. Sometimes you actually have to decide between dirt and boiled stale potatoes.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Holloway.
Yeah, actually, the Todd brings up a question related to one I was going to raise in cross-examination, and I do just think that it is a concern that Catholics have to take into account. Although again, on the grounds of not being single issue voters and not simply voting as an interest group, we can't go too far with it. But it's something you have to take into account. In other words, it does present kind of a problem for the church to have, as president of the United States, a Catholic who maybe is not entirely square in terms of his practice with the question of abortion and the legality of abortion. And I think it's, again, you can't make it as a deal breaker or anything because there's all kinds of questions you have to take into account. But it is kind of a bad position to be in as a Catholic, to have to vote for somebody who seems to be not square with the church's teaching on a question that is that fundamentally important. And that, in a way, is another problem with. You mentioned Trump can't receive communion either, but his errors are in a way less troubling because he's not a Catholic, right?
Fair enough. Yeah.
Okay. Next question is for Dr. Carson. This comes from Daniel Luke. He says, would you consider the Trump vote as a sort of the ends justify the means situation? For example, he may be rude, say ridiculous things, and doesn't denounce hate groups, but he's advocating for pro-life and appointing pro-Christian judges. If so, does this not go against what the church teaches, which is that the ends do not justify the means?
I think that that formulation is too simple. Right? I mean, that's a Machiavelli. It's a kind of popularized formulation of Machiavelli that the end justifies the means. Machiavelli teaches that the end of getting power justifies any means you use to get it. No Catholic would think that, but in real life politics, there are situations in which the end is good enough that even means that are not highly desirable can be acceptable. Of course, the end would never justify a means that is in itself intrinsically wrong. But I don't think we're in a situation like that with Trump. And simply as a factual matter, it is not true that Trump does not denounce hate groups. He has many times denounced hate groups. He may not have done it as quickly or in exactly the words that his political enemies want him to do, but he has done it. And so I don't view that as a serious criticism of him.
Okay. Dr. Rocha.
Yes, I'm here actually going to come to my opponent's aid a bit with a philosophical clarification. I hear a lot of Catholics, especially Catholics who claim that they're against modernism, invoking modern value theory, which is essentially the distinction between consequentialism or utilitarianism, which comes to us through Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, on the one hand, from deontology, which is the value theory of Immanuel Kant, which is where this phrase, the ends do not justify the means, is often taken from his categorical imperative. It's just very simple. Catholics don't have to be consequentialists or deontologists. Our tradition is millennia older than this. And if we go back to Aristotle, which is, of course, the pagan philosopher who through Arabic philosophy was taken up by Aquinas, even whenever Aristotle was looked down on by the church at a time, Aristotle gives us, I think, a much more fulsome ability to say, no, sometimes the ends justify the means if they're the right ends or the right means. In other words, the bottom line is that this talking point of ends justify the means and consequentialism and stuff is a modern Kantian point, but it's not Catholic.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. Dr. Rocha, this question comes from Cameron, not my wife. Who is Cameron's the name of my wife?
Fair enough.
Is your position that it is merely an acceptable option for a Catholic to vote for Biden, or is your position that a Catholic ought to vote for Biden and not Trump because Biden is in fact the candidate more in line with Catholic teaching?
I want to appreciate this question from Cameron. Because I've been rough on the last two questioners. But I want to say this introduces a very positive, in my mind, contribution to my argument. And it's so positive that I don't know if I even have a clear head about it completely. So let me simply say that I do believe my argument is much more on the grounds of acceptability and then, all things considered, preferability. But it's not going to close the knot around a strong normative argument in line with church teaching. And one of the people who haunt me on this are the people who aren't in the room, which is our third partiers. We've both taken a realist standpoint, which I appreciate. But in many ways, I think they have some interesting ways in which they can nudge into here, especially in contested, in states that aren't contested and things like that. So I mostly just want to appreciate this question and say the distinction between an argument for acceptability is a different question and argument than the one of a strong normative claims. Like Carson, I guess I'll punt the ball and say I don't speak on behalf of the church. I'm here speaking on my own prudential judgment as a philosopher. And so I think the most we can say is the acceptability in the end. But I really do appreciate the very careful way in which that was posed. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Holloway?
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add there because obviously I don't think that he's preferable even on Catholic grounds.
Fair enough.
So I'm not going to make the argument that Biden is. But yeah, I think I'm fine with the way Sam answered that question. I think I'll punt on this.
Okay, sounds good. We do have a funny comment that I can't help but reading. This comes from Jack Cladgett, and he's looking at the thumbnail of the two of you. It says, "Who's the one in the bolo tie? If he has..." he automatically has the victory. So I guess that's you, Sam. So I guess he was a big fan.
I say YOLO bolo.
Of your tie. Okay, this is for both speakers, so I'll give you 2 minutes each to answer this, if that's okay, and we'll start with Dr. Rocha. What would you need to see from the other candidate to vote for them? Or what would they need to change, either from a policy standpoint or a personal standpoint, in order for you to vote for the other candidate?
This is a good question, and I don't think it's a foreign question to my judgment, simply because of the fact, as I'm going to mention in my closing statements, I chose to not vote in the last election. So there were a few things that I wanted to see from a Trump presidency that I didn't see. And that as recent as his COVID diagnosis, I even wondered if he could reverse course. To be honest, I don't think if he would have at the COVID diagnosis, it would have sufficiently changed my mind. But there were a few things. First of all, Trump actually promised that many cases sort of a healthcare program that could match basically a Medicare for all kind of a thing. He continually says that sort of pre-existing conditions will be addressed. And if he could have come up with a substantive and detailed policy proposal for that, I think it would have really changed my view. The second is on DACA. Obama failed miserably on DACA, and the DREAM Act is as old as 2001, and people are being left hanging. Actual people are being left hanging all over this country. The Republican Party has, I don't understand why, continually refused to pick up the ball that the Democrats have dropped time after time and time again. I think Trump could have done that, but instead he's gone after that wall. And as someone who's lived on the border and knows the Rio Grande, it's the stupidest idea you can imagine, just in terms of geography and basic, terrestrial borders and whatnot. So if he could have changed his policy or taken a different approach to immigration and to healthcare, like he even intimated at certain points, I could see myself having a very different outlook on a Trump presidency for sure.
Dr. Holloway, you have 2 minutes.
That's a really great and a very difficult question. I have to admit, it's like full disclosure. I mean, I want to be thoroughly Catholic, but I'm also thoroughly Republican. And it's hard for me to admit that I would vote for a Democrat or for Joe Biden. I've been aware of Joe Biden since I was in high school, and I never liked him. And I don't like him any better now, although I do find him a likable guy personally. I just mean in terms of his politics. But to think through the things I mentioned in my case, I mean, obviously, if Biden were, and there used to be pro-life Democrats like Governor Casey of Pennsylvania, that doesn't seem to be a position that's easily occupied by Democrats these days because the party has gone in a different direction. So I'm thinking that for myself, probably the whole package would make it very hard for me to vote for him. But obviously, if he were pro-life, there'd be a much more powerful Catholic case to vote for him, or if he were more moderate on the question in a way which, again, I sympathize for the situation because the party has moved so far left, and if you're going to have any future in it, you kind of have to go along with it. It's not a justification for it, but one could imagine a Democrat nominee trying to move the party to the middle or admit that the concerns of conservative pro-lifers are legitimate ones and we should have a more constructive dialogue rather than just a clash of absolutes on that question. And then also on religious liberty, like I mentioned, from what we get from the newspapers, and we don't know if they're reliable, but Biden apparently argued against some of the mandates that the bishops found problematic in Obamacare. So he might take a different view on that. And I suspect that as a person or as an individual he would, but it's difficult for him given the nature of the whole party apparatus that he has to carry and be guided by. But yeah, I think those kinds of things would make it easier to vote for him if you were a moderate Catholic or a moderate Republican who didn't like Trump,
Okay, and now here's another question for both of you. This comes from Christopher Belcher. Maybe we'll have Dr. Holloway respond first. It's a bit lengthy, so stay with me. He says, I'm sure by now most of us have read and listened to the many articles and podcasts on how a Catholic can vote for a candidate that supports evil, like both parties do to some extent or another, as long as they have weighed things and are doing so despite such positions, and absolutely not for such positions, because they believe that by doing so it keeps a greater evil from happening. I'd like both to hear from Dr. Sam and Dr. Carson why the math, so to speak, adds up for their side. I'd add that personally, I thought I could support neither party this year. I voted for Trump in 2016 and was planning on voting for a third party. However, with Democrats making it clear they don't care about the rule of law this summer, and with the most anti-life platform ever, see Biden's latest remarks about codifying Roe versus Wade into law, and the rise of soft totalitarianism from the left, see Yelp for the latest insane example, it is pushing the math into Trump's corner for me. So, Dr. Holloway, you have 2 minutes, and then Dr. Rocha, I'll give you 2 minutes too.
Yeah, well, I mean, this goes back to a question raised by an earlier questioner, and I do want to use it to kind of say a little bit more about that earlier question about does the end justify the means? To present it that way, as Sam said, is kind of prejudicial to the way of thinking about politics that the church has invited us to or recognized, going all the way back to Aristotle. To say that prudence has to be brought to bear means that in voting, you are voting for somebody that you cannot approve entirely. You are accepting certain bads or evils or defects and trying to achieve other goods. So that is a kind of weighing that has to take place. And although I like to use the word calculus, I guess it's not really a question of math. I don't know if you could really tote it up in terms of math. Obviously, from what I've said, as the kind of Catholic I've been and the kind of conservative I've been, the question of religious liberty and of life, those are the things that are most important to me and have been for a long time. So I've always let those guide me while trying to respect the other issues that also have to be taken into account. So the math is pretty simple for me on that. I mean, there are actually, as I think I've said and indicated, and I sympathize with some of the complaints Christopher's making too about the events over the summer. My instincts are very conservative. I'm traditional. I'm a law and order guy. I don't like to see those kinds of things happening. I don't like to see police misconduct either. So all the things that the questioner raised are, to me, further reasons to do what I'm going to do anyway. But the calculus is based primarily on the life question. So I guess I was going to say, just to clarify my own position, I probably would vote for any Republican rather than any Democrat that I can imagine being produced under these circumstances because of those issues. Although on the question of foreign policy and trade policy and things like that, I am also pleased with Trump.
Okay. Dr. Rocha, 2 minutes.
Yeah, I appreciate the front end of the question. I think everyone can see by the testimonial on the back end that it's not the same question for me as it is for Carson. So again, I'm not going to pretend to answer it in a flat or neutral way. I think that this whole idea of the math is very dangerous, actually, to get into, because the moment we apply too heavy a quantitative metaphor to human life, we actually lose the thing we're trying to defend to begin with. In other words, no one's life can be quantified. Life is immeasurably sacred, and the sacredness of life doesn't increase or decrease by numerical counts. I know everyone knows this, and it's just a metaphor, but I think it's a dangerous one because it can suddenly give us the tools to quantitatively use these metaphors against those who are genuinely invested in other things. Here's what I'm primarily invested in with respect to Biden. And let me be clear, as Carson kind of smoked me out on this, he wasn't my candidate through the primary. And I, to be honest, find his platform, I'm just glad he has one. I'm not thrilled. What I believe, though, is that Biden is someone who the platform I would have liked can talk to and can move and can push, in particular on immigration, in particular on the status of DACA, which is itself just a very kind of stand-in feature, the languishing DREAM Act, which has been sitting basically under Republicans and Democrats. Also, with respect to refugees, which is a huge concern in the world right now, Trump has actually reduced America's receptivity to refugees down to 15,000, which is the lowest it's ever been. So if we're concerned about issues of life, closing our doors not only to immigrants, but also refugees and asylum seekers is something that really bothers me. But at the end of the day, to be honest, it's not the issues that drive me. It's the fact that I don't trust Trump to listen to anyone, including his own party. And I think his party has shown us that they don't trust him either.
Okay, thank you. Okay, let's one final question. You guys are doing fantastic. Before we do closing statements, and this question is directed to Dr. Rocha, who can have 2 minutes, and then Dr. Carson can have a minute to respond. This comes from Jim. He says, I agree with Dr. Rocha that one should not be a single issue voter. One should properly weigh the impact different issues have. Abortion kills 1 million people in America each year. Name another issue that does that.
So you want to say like an empirical name another issue?
I can't tell if he's being rhetorical or if his basic point is he agrees we should properly weigh the impact different issues have, but I think he's saying that abortion's preeminent because it kills 1 million people in America every year. I can't tell if this next one is like just rhetorical.
Yeah, sure,
it might be.
Sure.
Name another issue that
well,
does
I would
that.
first say if you're going to ask someone a question, you should ask it to them in a way that's not so rhetorical that they get stuck in the metaphor by the end of it. So if you really want to know the answer, don't fantasize it into a kind of rhetoric that prevents me from even answering it empirically. I don't even know the numbers on this. Let me go back to my last point, though. The quantification of human life for the sake of human life is in itself, I believe, a rhetorical violation of the value of human life. What I mean to say by saying it that way is that whenever we pit lives against lives and put numbers and all this stuff, we lose the value of life in that calculus just as badly as we might lose it otherwise. There's a real wise idea in the Hebrew tradition that doesn't allow for the counting of humans. And I think that that's really important here. Now, you might say you're just doing that so you don't have to talk about the lives that are actually objectively lost by abortion. Well, look, Jews, I bet, would love to use the numbers of the Holocaust or the Shoah to make their argument. But at the end of the day, they don't. They make a proper moral case for the abomination that the Shoah was. And I think we should listen to that, not to the social science or the statistics on that. And so this is, again, I think a call to my brothers and sisters in the church to be more Catholic and be a little bit less reliant upon these kinds of metaphors that ultimately reduce life down to just kind of a sledgehammer, which is, in my mind, deeply un-Catholic and not consistent with the principles of the sacredness of life.
Dr. Holloway, you have a minute.
Yeah, in preparing for the debate, I did take a look at the statistics. I think it's like there's somewhere in the range of 600,000 to 800,000 abortions a year in America. It was more in the 1990s. It was about 1.5 million a year. But I do think that the qualitative question is more important than the quantitative question. There could be many policies the government could have through neglect or ineptitude that could lead to a lot of people getting killed or dying. I think the real objection with regard to abortion is that people are people, right? The church tells us we have to regard them as people, are deliberately killed who are innocent, right? That's what makes it a different issue. And that's what I think makes it not a single issue, but a preeminent issue. I think that's why the bishops think of it that way, that innocent human lives are being taken on purpose. That's the problem.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. We're coming to the conclusion of this debate, and I just want to remind everybody that next week we will be hosting a debate between Stephanie Gray-Connors and Dr. Malcolm Potts, who is an abortionist, and so we'll be getting into these issues pretty heavily next week, so please be sure to subscribe to the channel, and that way you won't miss out. All right, we have 5 minutes each for closing statements, and Sam will go first. I want to say this, though. You guys have been very polite. But I would really like you to kind of swing for the fences here. So here's my question to sort of set up your closing statement. How crucial do you think it is that Catholic voters support your preferred candidate? What is really at stake here? So I hope you can give us your best shot. So Sam, whenever you start, I'll click 5 minutes.
Great. Well, I hope you don't think I'm underperforming too bad here, Matt. A lot of the audience, I expect, actually dismisses out of hand the very reasons and arguments and generally won't talk to me. And so I really appreciate the fact that you have taken the time to listen and to platform these cases and arguments. And by no means do I speak on behalf of the church or any ecclesiastical entity. Ultimately, these are my reasons that I have to take to the pillow and ultimately to church and to my public life. What I want to do to try and swing for the fences is to address the qualitative and subjective question. I realize this is probably for some people the least convincing. Who cares why Sam decided to do this? But I just want to share with you my story here because I think my story is a bit unique. I voted for Alan Keyes as a writing candidate in 2000 because I thought that he provided me with the most Catholic standing up to the Republican establishment and George Bush. After that, I find myself voting for write-ins from everything from the DSA to the Party of Liberation and Solidarity, and in other cases, not voting at all out of protest. And last year, I'll be honest, I live in Canada. It was so inconceivable to me that Donald Trump would be elected. And to be honest, Clinton's, especially her reputation, preceded her, in particular in terms of being something of a hawk. I didn't do it. I couldn't do it, I guess. And so I had to live with that for the last 4 years. And in particular, I had to live with that on August 3rd, 2019, whenever a shooter went into a Walmart store in El Paso, Texas, and shot 23 people. And whenever I read the manifesto that talked about the Hispanic invasion of Texas, reading that from Canada, knowing that I didn't vote, realizing that Trump's way of framing rhetorically my community and my people contributed to this lunatic going into a store and shooting 23 people, it rocked me to my core. And the bishop of Diocese of El Paso, in fact, wrote a powerful pastoral letter called Night Will Be No More, a pastoral letter to the people of God in El Paso. And, I read that and I felt incredibly convicted. By the way, the Catholic practice of conscience is also something we do at confession and the examination of conscience. Reading that document and looking at my response, which was largely apathetic, largely idealistic, largely driven by sort of a kind of, I would say, juvenile naivete, I was brought down to reality, to even a kind of real politics that I've never been brought down before. I think COVID has only made this more real to me. I had an uncle, my tío Bobby, died of COVID. And I've seen Trump say how we don't need to be dominated by COVID, but COVID has dominated a lot of people's lives who have died, and I don't take kindly to that kind of talk about something like that. And so for me, my most swinging for the fences reasons are also my most personal ones. But I believe that there's a lot of people in the Catholic Church who have the same kinds of personal reasons that are often cast aside for impersonal, external reasons that we're told are inadmissible to the conversation. I fully admit there's no subjectivist, relativistic calculus that can take your personal life experience and put it above principles, truth, beauty, goodness, all those things. But I also challenge my brothers and sisters in the church to realize that a lot of people are suffering under Trump, and a lot of the conversation, in particular about race, has created a fairly broken establishment. We've left out Black Catholics in this conversation, but I would challenge anyone here who wants to dismiss BLM the way it's been dismissed on this show to bring in Gloria Purvis, have them talk to you about BLM and Black Lives Matter and what the 8 minutes and 26 seconds of George Floyd's death did subjectively to Black Catholic brothers and sisters, what El Paso did subjectively to Hispanic and Mexican American Catholics. We are a part of the church too. And I think you're going to find that we're going to vote for Biden quantitatively, but not for quantitative reasons and not for abstractions, but largely because our hearts have been broken over these 4 years. And until we see our brothers and sisters who face us from a different, maybe national or ethnic outlook, able to embrace us and see us and talk to us the way our good bishop spoke to us in that community in El Paso, we're not going to figure this out. But I think you all are going to lose, so enjoy it.
Okay, thank you so much, Sam. I appreciate you being here and for agreeing to do this debate. I really do. Dr. Holloway, you have 5 minutes. Start whenever you like.
Okay. Well, our friends on the left, and here I'm not referring to Sam, although he's a friend, but I'm not thinking that he's the kind of leftist I'm thinking of. But our friends on the left like to tell us that they're on the right side of history and we're on the wrong side of history. And they present a narrative of history as inevitable progress, with progress conveniently defined as irresistible movement in the direction of the kind of society that they want, kind of society in which they set the standards, and Catholics and other traditional Christians have to submit to the standards that they set. In 2016, with the help of Catholic voters, Donald Trump proved the left wrong. We don't have to submit to their version of history. We can make history. We can participate in building a society that is more just according to our own standards. We can't make it exactly as we would wish. We can make it better. Trump's victory in 2016 was truly extraordinary, and it represents an extraordinary second chance, I think, for Catholics to make the country better. In 2008, an openly pro-abortion candidate, Barack Obama, won the presidency handily. And during the course of his first term, his administration proved to be not sympathetic to the kind of religious liberty claims that Catholics make and other traditional Christians make. And yet, despite those controversies surrounding his presidency, he easily won re-election in 2012. And looking at those events, we might have thought that the future of Catholicism in American politics would be entirely one of rearguard actions or continual concessions to an aggressively secularist government just trying to protect whatever he could. But Trump proved it's possible to win the presidency by campaigning in an openly pro-life, an openly pro-religious liberty manner. And now it's understandable to me that at the time, that is in 2016, some well-intentioned Catholics declined to vote for Trump, regarding his pro-life and pro-religious liberty promises as nothing but promises. Maybe they're just the empty promises of a self-promoting showman. But I don't think there's any room to think that anymore. He's been president for almost 4 years, and he's demonstrated, I think, to any fair-minded observer that he's willing to follow through on his policy commitments, and really to do so courageously and tenaciously, even in the face of ferocious opposition. By re-electing Trump as president, Catholic voters will be carrying forward this essential work. They'll be laying the political and legal groundwork of a society that moves in a more pro-life direction, with regard to abortion especially, that moves away from moral and constitutional error, the idea that there is a right to abortion in the Constitution, a right to take the lives of some innocent human beings, those who are not yet born. And we'll be laying the political and legal foundation for a society with a robust understanding of religious liberty, or a country in which Catholics and other traditional Christians and other traditional religious believers are free to teach and live according to their moral beliefs, beliefs about the sanctity of life, the nature of marriage and the family, and to shape the public culture according to those beliefs. In voting for Trump for those reasons, Catholics will not be doing anything selfish. We won't be choosing a narrow politics of Catholic interest or Catholic identity contrary to the common good. We will, on the contrary, be promoting the fundamentals of the common good as they are revealed by faith and also known to natural reason: the sanctity of life, marriage and family, and the religion that we've been blessed to inherit, and that's the source of so much that is good in our civilization. I think in voting to protect those things, we'll be acting as good Catholics and good Americans. At the same time, in voting to re-elect President Trump, Catholics will be supporting a more prudent approach to foreign policy, one that does not involve America in wars in order to remake foreign nations in our own image. And we'll be voting for a more humane approach to economics, one that does not seek only economic growth, but the kind of growth that's particularly beneficial to working class and lower income Americans. In voting to re-elect Trump, we will not be placing the powers of the presidency in the hands of a man who has no experience with such responsibilities, but in the hands of a man who has discharged those responsibilities successfully and faithfully. Finally, in voting to re-elect President Trump, we will be voting to revitalize our democracy in the sense of ensuring that our self-government is not just a show, not just a sham, but by doing so, we'll be rewarding a politician who actually meant what he said when he delivered a platform and delivered on those promises that he made to get elected in the first place. So that's my effort to swing for the fences.
Well, Dr. Sam Rocha, Dr. Carson Holloway, thank you kindly for agreeing to do this debate. I know that we can always sort of respond, and we could probably talk about this all evening, but thank you again. You guys did great. As we wrap up, anywhere you would like to point people to go, perhaps a website, podcast, a book?
Thank you.
Yeah.
www.samrocha.com. I've got books. I've got music. By the way, I'm a huge Chad Engelland fan. People should check out his book Phenomenology, which is killer, by MIT Press. I just wrote about it in America. I also recorded the world's first Augustinian soul album called Late to Love, which came out in 2014. So if you have Augustine people, send them over to my album. Anyway, check out the website, and also please email me. I'm happy to dialogue, and I'm really committing myself between now and the end of the election to try and engage the Catholic community. I'll be on Crisis next week.
Okay. Did you want to give your email, or will they find that at your website?
It'll be on the website.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure,
Just
sure.
click
That could
around.
be a bit dangerous. Dr. Holloway, anywhere you'd like to point people to?
Yeah, I don't have a website or anything like that. I am merely a humble political science teacher. I have written a lot of things for the Witherspoon Institute's public discourse. So if you want to read stuff that I've written, you could look there, or Law and Liberty, which is kind of a libertarian-leaning website. Although I'm not a libertarian myself, I've published things there. So if people are interested in my thought about the Constitution or the kind of moral and cultural questions, they could look there. I was a visiting fellow for a while at the Heritage Foundation, so Heritage has some longer pieces on their website that I've written. So those would be the places to look, I think.
Sounds great. Well, big thank you to everybody who's been watching and who will watch. Do us a favor, click subscribe, click that bell button. That's a great way to support the channel. And as I say, be sure to come back next week, where we will have Stephanie Gray-Connors and Dr. Malcolm Potts arguing about abortion. So that's bound to be a very interesting debate. God bless you, and thanks so much.